Several people have told me yesterday that they find the title of the presentation a bit enigmatic. So I decided to give it a bit of a subtitle, using airborne lidar to understand landscape and land use history. And when I started preparing for the presentation, I started with a couple of questions in my head. What do we use lidar for in archaeology, and how has that changed over time? I've been in this for more than 15 years now, looking at lidar data. We now have a second generation of lidar data covering the whole state of Baden-Württemberg. And you will see the difference that it makes. And when I started out, it was a lot about visualizing. It was a lot about, look what I can do, look what I can show. So it was about seeing things, it was about discovering things. And then later it went on to collecting, cataloging, and also analyzing size, volumes, and other parameters of archaeological features or sites that we found in the lidar data. And now with increasingly better, higher resolution lidar data, we can more and more look at the sequence of things, at the relative chronology, and we can more and more develop landscape histories. And it's not that one of those things replaces the other one, it's just adding new possibilities over time. So let's just look at this example area here. We have a forest that's called Endinger Wald in the Rhine Valley between Offenburg on the German side of the Rhine and Strasbourg on the French side of the Rhine. And the Rhine Valley there is rather flat and is about 10 kilometers wide. And we have this relatively large forest area. And if you know the Rhine Valley a bit, there's not all that much forest there. And one of my questions when I look at new areas now is usually I look at forests and I'm like, oh, how long has this been a forest? And in many cases, our historical maps go back to the late 18th century in this area, around 1780, 1785. And we have some historical maps from the early or middle or late 19th century. And of course, we have the data from today. And what you can see here, maybe we have something. Especially here in the center of the forest, in the 18th and 19th century, this was not forest yet, and by now it has been reforested. So that will come in as an interesting point later on. And then we want to know what happened in the landscape before the time where we have historical maps. And so that's where the title comes from, like peeling away the layers of time in the lidar data. And I start in the middle of the 20th century, and then we'll just go back in time. And this is the first statewide lidar data that we have for Baden-Württemberg. And you see not very much at all. There's a little bit of something here, maybe something here. And this is based on a 1 meter resolution DTM flown at 1 ground point per square meter. And this is also based on a 1 meter resolution DTM flown at 8 ground points per square meter. So the difference here is a lot about the vegetation filtering, which gets much, much better as you have more and more ground measurements. So here we see a lot of traces from World War II, starting with a bomb crater, which fortunately for the guys at the front lines there, hit rather far away. We have some anti-tank trenches, we have fighting trenches, we have bunkers, earth-covered bunkers, and we have fighting positions. I don't know what was stationed here, machine guns or something. And you also see that there's some other things in the area, some ditches. But as we zoom out at the size of the entire forest, we see that those fighting trenches are all along the western edge of the forest. Bomb craters seem to be targeting areas with not really very much at all. I don't really know what this is about. What the targets actually were would be worthwhile looking at documents from the time. Um, but yeah, those forests in the Rhine Valley, they are quite full with traces from World War II. And here, for example, you see some of those bomb craters, and you see lots of ditches, drainage ditches for forestry. And at first, I would say they're clearly not very old. Are they really archaeology? And then you look at it a bit more closely, and you see that here and here, for example, those bomb craters, they destroyed those drainage ditches, and they were not reactivated afterwards. So by 1945 at the latest, those drainage ditches were not considered relevant anymore. And then I was looking at other forests in the area, and I found one forest where some of those drainage ditches were already drawn in maps from 1786. And in some other areas near a Cistercian monastery, there are drainage ditches in the forest that date back to the monastic times of the Cistercians. So I mapped those things, and as we zoom out, we see this forest is quite full with those drainage ditches. And then I tried to find out why is it like that? Why are they more densely spread in some places and less densely in other places? And I subtracted the overall landscape slope from the DTM to have like the relative elevation of the area, and you see that there's like higher, like in yellow, higher areas, and in blue, more low-lying areas, which will come in interesting in a moment. Then we have field systems. In this area, it's almost entirely rich in furrow, and when you look at this, you always see some differences. You have on the right-hand side here, you have blocks of rich in furrow that are very, where the stripes are very straight, where the boundaries of the blocks are very straight. It looks very orderly. And on the left-hand side, you have stripes that are more curvilinear. They're not really delineated by straight lines. It's more amorphous. And when you zoom out and you look at the distribution of those rich in furrow fields, you see that you have a lot in the central part of the forest, and then some things along the edges, and some smaller ones somewhere in there. Oops. And then you look at the forest cover from the, for example, here mid-19th century, and you see that in this area, many of those rich in furrow fields were still not reforested in the mid-19th century. And those are those that are very orderly, with straight lines, parallel lines, straight outlines. And then you look back at this relative topography map, and you see that those very straight, orderly, rich in furrow, they go across everything. They're in the high-lying areas, they're in the low-lying areas. It just doesn't matter. Then you look at the more curvilinear, rich in furrow, that is also not delineated by straight lines, but it's more following the topography, and it's lying more in the higher topographic positions. And here, for example, and here you have a nice example of those inverted S-shaped rich in furrow, which would be like sort of the classical ones. And you can also see, if you look at the maps from the late 18th century, that some of those older rich in furrow, they followed topography, and they're in places which at that time were not forests, but I think that would be in that map the signature for orchards, not fields. So you look at the distribution of those rich in furrow, and you can separate between this darker green, which are those younger rich in furrow fields, and this bluish color, which are the older type. And we can also compare the topographic position, where you see that those younger rich in furrow, they are both in the higher and lower lying parts of the forest, whereas the older rich in furrow, they're really preferentially located on the higher lying topography. So there's quite a few characteristics with which you can divide those younger and older ridge and furrow fields. That's the limitation of the blocks, which is mostly straight and along modern ways and ditches for the younger fields, and quite irregular or curvilinear and following natural features for the older fields. The shape of the blocks for the younger ones would be rectangular or parallelograms or trapezoids, and for the older ones would be oval or mostly irregular. The size of the blocks is also interesting. The younger ridge and furrow fields, the blocks are about 10 times as big as the older ones. Morphology of the individual stripes would be straight and parallel with modern features for the younger fields, and mostly curvilinear or inverted S-shaped for the older ones, and not parallel with modern features. Topographic position, as I said, the younger fields have no or almost no relation to the relative topography, whereas the older ones, they are preferentially located on the higher positions. Cross-cutting relationship, also interesting. The younger ones are very rarely cut by modern ways or ditches, whereas that's quite common for the older ones. So we can really, with each of those characteristics, we can already separate whether we're looking at older or younger ridge and furrow, where the younger ones I would more or less tentatively put into the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and the older ones, they would probably go into the time of the maximum agricultural expansion of the Middle Ages. Yeah, so you have those areas with ridge and furrow, and then you look again and you see that there's something else there. There's very straight lines that cut through those ridge and furrow. No, they don't cut through. They're interrupted here by the ridge and furrow. When you look closely, you see that maybe they're still vaguely under there. So they're older than the older ridge and furrow. If you look at the average cross profiles, you see that they are around 20 meters wide, and they have only elevation contrast of a few centimeters relative to the surroundings. So those are features that you will just not see in the forest when you're out there. They're just, for the naked eye, they're not there. You see them in the lidar data, but you would not find them in the field. Zooming out again, looking at the whole forest, you see that there are some of those traces of an older land division. Zoom out a bit more and you see, oh, it continues in the next forest. And then this line seems to continue all the way through, even though there's fields in between and have been fields in between for several hundred years, aiming at the peak of a small hill from which we have, for example, Roman finds. And to give you an idea of how straight this line is, which is over 10 kilometers long, the maximum deviation from the perfectly straight line is 8 meters, which, if you think about it, the lines are about 20 meters wide. This might already be my mapping error rather than a true deviation of the line from the perfectly straight line. Let's zoom out a bit more, and we're looking at a good part of southwestern Baden-Württemberg with the Black Forest here. We have the city of Baal here, Strasbourg here, and you have an area around 40 kilometers east-west, goes all the way to here, and more than 100 kilometers north-south, where you have in many of the forests those small black lines there, those traces of older land division, which all have the same orientation. And to make it a bit more clear, because it doesn't really show that much at this scale, just let's look at the main traces of the land division, and they all have the same orientation. And they cover quite a large area. And since they are older than the oldest ridge and furrow that we have in all the forests that I looked at, who who would possibly do that? Well, of course, the Romans. And we have now been able, by looking at some archaeological data, to narrow it down to somewhere in the time of those three Roman emperors, sometime between the year 72 and the year 90, the year 90 being a limiting date, because at that time, at the latest, the Roman province of Germania Superior had been established. And yeah, somewhere in that time, those field systems or those land divisions have been established, which is quite funny because we're at the same time, almost to the year, that the Roman predecessor of York was founded in the year 71. So somebody who was present when the Roman town here in York was founded may have been there and working on those land divisions just a few years later, which makes it for me, like a story that feels much more real than just looking at, oh, the Romans did that and so on. Okay, and with this, thank you.